Hey everyone, this is Lomi, and not too long ago I shared a video about sculpting a doll head to become my book character Tahl and then 3D printing it in resin. When I started this project, it was my second original sculpt after Rune, but the first I decided to do all digitally. I printed him in a flesh tone and put it on the doll's body, but then something changed. I was happy with the printed head, but over the span of a few weeks, I started having the nagging urge to change what I was doing and have him professionally cast instead. I printed another head in gray resin to become a master for casting, and I didn't think to start recording the process until I'd started sanding, but you can see what he looked like right after this choice was made. I streamed a little bit of the finishing process. Because of how I had hollowed the head to improve print quality, there were some thin spots inside the head that I didn't like, so I filled the area with epoxy and started filling bumps and ridges with white Tamiya putty because it dries a little bit faster than the red Bondo I typically use. If you're wondering about the dark banding around his nose and mouth, that's the result of a micro-delamination issue where the suction force causes a microscopic separation between print layers where uncured resin seeps in and cures through diffusion of UV through subsequent layers. This is common in larger format printers, and it can cause some slight bulging or warping in the surface of the print. My fixes for it have been hit and miss, but since it doesn't affect the overall integrity of the print, it's something I can just sand to fix. I wish I could say the finishing process was interesting, but it's really not. Sanding is my least favorite part of any doll project, and that's pretty much exclusively what preparing a head for casting entails. I use a combination of sandpapers and sanding sponges, but the sanding process takes me a long time because it's really easy for me to hurt myself due to my joint issues. Most of the doll's head doesn't take a lot of sanding. The surface is really easy to even out because of how well the print came out. So after I had all the pieces and the spot putty and the added epoxy sanded, it was time for primer. The first layer of primer was my favorite automotive filler primer because it would help even out any ridges from print layers that I may have missed, as well as helping fill in any scratches in the surface. The primer allowed me to see there was still a slight ridge around that banded resin, so that was my primary focus, but there were also some bumps and lumps in the epoxy and filler putty that required attention. I think I've mentioned it in passing, but the little cup-shaped piece fits in the doll's neck. I've always liked dolls that have a lot of mobility for head positioning. Some dolls have multiple ridges inside the head for the S-hook to be placed, which allows them to raise or lower their head farther, but I felt like there had to be a way to do it that didn't require moving the S-hook all the time. One way I found to achieve a great range of motion for large dolls was to make a cup piece that fits inside the neck that moves as its own independent joint. This allows the doll to look way up or way down without having to move the hook in the head. The downside is that it's not the most attractive, since it can look a little gappy on dolls with very thin necks, but for the body I chose, I found it hasn't been super visible when I pose him. Since this was only my second original sculpt, and my first done completely digitally, it was a time for me to do a lot of learning and experimenting, and I'm sure I'll figure out more graceful ways to accomplish the same thing in the future, but this is what Tahl is. After the first layer of primer was sanded, I used my airbrush to cover him again with Mr. Surfacer 1000, a process my airbrush did not like at all, but it let me see some places that needed improvement. I'd gotten the ridge off completely on one side of his face, but not the other. There was still a tiny bit just below his nose, and there were some scratches around his eyes and ears that still needed some help. It's fast to see it come together in video, but this process took weeks because I can't sand for very long periods of time or my shoulders start to hurt. It also takes a good while for things like the epoxy and paint to cure before they can be sanded, so that slows things down a lot too. It's also a process that has to be repeated over and over. I wish it were as easy as just printing, sanding, and priming, but it just isn't. It's a lot of layers of priming, sanding, adding putty, sanding, adding more primer, repeat. So it's very much a labor of love. I learned a lot when I sculpted and cast rune, and I may actually revisit that project eventually, just because there are a few things I would fix and change about the head sculpt. But Tahl is definitely more polished, and that's why I think he's going to also be different for me, in that I'm currently planning to open a limited pre-order to offer this sculpt for sale. I'm still figuring out the details, but I had a lot of people reach out to me to say they really liked the shape of his features because there's something you don't typically see in dolls. And, well, that's kind of why I decided to make him. I couldn't find anything that worked, so I made my own. After I'd spent some time smoothing the eye wells, I checked to make sure eyes would actually fit. The 11mm ones were a little gappy, but 14mm fit really nicely, though the iris was big. So I think 12mm eyes or 14mm small iris eyes would work well for this doll. After that, it was time for more primer. Since my airbrush didn't like it, I got a spray can of Mr. Surfacer that I used instead. And while it looked good from a distance, up close it revealed a lot of sanding marks I'd missed that now appeared as scratches in the doll's surface. So for what felt like the millionth time, it was back to sanding. By the time I got to this point though, it was very clear that he'd come together nicely. The inside of his head is a little lumpy because I can't twist my hand in there the way I need to be able to smooth things out. That's one way that doing a faceplate system has advantages. Faceplates and head backs aren't nearly as deep as heads with head caps, so it's easier to get in there. The particular combination of twisting my hand and holding the head put a lot of strain on my shoulders, which were already pretty stressed from spending weeks sanding on and off. So at some point, I decided that it would just be the big fault in this sculpt. The inside of the head is a little rough because it's all I'm physically capable of right now, and I'll learn from that and figure out a better way to do it next time. I saved a bunch of progress photos in a highlight on Instagram if you're interested in more behind the scenes work on how this guy came to be. After one more coat of Mr. Surfacer, Tahl is finally ready. I wish I could say it only took me weeks, but I started sculpting this head a year and a half ago, so bringing him to this point has been a very long process. He'll be on his way to my contracted caster soon, so the next step in his journey will be getting the very first sample cast. Once it arrives, I'll be sharing that here along with more about the caster I'm working with, and then he'll be available for pre-order. Hopefully you don't mind the bumpy insides. I don't think it's too bad, and it doesn't affect eye placement. It's just not pretty inside. The outside is another story though, and I'm so pleased with how he's come together. That's all for today though. Thanks for watching. Bye.